After a tense and thrilling duel in Texas, Max Verstappen extended his championship lead over Lewis Hamilton to 12 points with 5 races left to run. After all that action, we've got 5 highs and 4 lows from the US Grand Prix to rattle through, so let's get into it, starting with those highs. The 2 championship contenders were in a league of their own on Sunday in Austin, but I have to give the first high to Max Verstappen and Red Bull, as there's no denying that this could be a really crucial victory in the championship chase. It seemed like almost everybody had Mercedes nailed on for victory before this weekend, but by Saturday it was clear that Red Bull had the upper hand. Max took full advantage and was the only man to get into the 132s in qualifying, but the race was an epic slugfest between the top 2 which could have gone either way. Hamilton made the better start and took the lead brilliantly into turn 1, but it was obvious in that first stint that Verstappen was easily able to follow the Mercedes. Such was Verstappen's pace that when Red Bull attempted the undercut, he actually had the job done and had got the gap he needed halfway round on his outlap. This gave him the lead of the race, but then Red Bull gave him a huge task for the final stint by bringing him in on lap 29 for a mammoth 27 lap stint on the hards. This was an ultra aggressive strategy by Red Bull that favoured taking track position above all else. When Hamilton eventually pitted on lap 37, he had tyres that were 8 laps younger, meaning he could push hard and challenge Verstappen in the final stint. Verstappen admitted to being concerned about this strategy, as did Red Bull boss Christian Horner, and the tyres were not in good condition by the time that he finished the race, but he did brilliantly to keep them in shape for the majority of that stint and managed to keep Hamilton out of DRS range. He then benefited from some timely DRS of his own behind Mick Schumacher as they entered the final lap. I think this is a day where both of the championship challengers were at their very best. Max tenaciously took the lead and then held on to it as Hamilton was attacking him late on, while Lewis made the most of a day where Mercedes didn't have the best car. But as has been said, this track was thought to be a Mercedes stronghold, so it's a real blow for their championship hopes to lose out to Verstappen here, especially with Mexico and Brazil around the corner, both circuits which are expected to suit the Red Bull over the Mercedes. It's also worth shouting out Sergio Perez, who on paper finished 42 seconds behind his teammate, but it came to light after the race that he was without his drinks bottle for the entirety of the race, and he ended up describing it as one of the most difficult physically of his career. But it was still a second podium in a row for the Mexican, important points for Red Bull, and great momentum heading into his home race next time out. The second high goes to Charles Leclerc, who might as well have been the invisible man on Sunday afternoon in Austin. That's how little we saw of him on the TV broadcast. This is because he ended up nearly half a minute clear of the Ricciardo, Bottas, Sainz and Norris scrap, and he even briefly looked like threatening Sergio Perez for third late in the race. Fourth was a really decent result, and Ferrari now sit just 3.5 points behind McLaren in the Constructors' Championship. And while Leclerc had rode off into the sunset, Carlos Sainz had an eventful race behind him. He had a really thrilling battle with the McLarens early on, doing well to make his soft compound tyres last as long as he did, but 5th place probably was possible based on his pace, and because he couldn't get past Ricciardo and banged wheels with him, he then lost out to the recovering Bottas towards the end. Still, a pretty good day's work for Ferrari all round. Another man who had a really strong weekend was Yuki Tsunoda, and he gets the third high for this race. He had a relatively quiet afternoon by his standards, which is probably a good thing. He made it through to Q3 for the second weekend in a row, and he finished the race in 9th place, which was probably the maximum possible result for AlphaTauri this weekend. And with Gasly out of the race, those 2 points are going to be really crucial in AlphaTauri's battle with Alpine for 5th in the Constructors' Championship. For the second race in a row, he showed some really good defensive work up against a Mercedes, this time holding Valtteri Bottas at bay early on in the race. This is the kind of form that Tsunoda needs to show to convince people that he belongs in Formula 1 for the long term. I'm going to give the next high to Sebastian Vettel, who was the biggest mover in the race, using clever strategy to go from 18th to 10th, having started at the back due to an engine penalty. Aston Martin ran longer than all of the cars around them, which allowed them to have fresher tyres at the end of both stints. This allowed Vettel to pick off Russell, Giovinazzi and Alonso before the Spaniard retires. And finally, he got past Raikkonen late on when the Finn spun off, which handed him a well-earned point. And he also finished well ahead of Stroll, who was caught up in a Turn 1 incident with Nicholas Latifi. And the last high for this weekend goes to Daniel Ricciardo, who was loving life in Austin. He was there to witness Zach Brown getting a tattoo, he sported some interesting fashion choices, and he got to drive a classic Nascar around the COTA circuit. And then he carried that good feeling into the event by out-qualifying Norris and then comfortably finishing ahead of him in the race. To me, this was probably his most convincing drive for McLaren aside from that win in Monza. He showed really good in wheel-to-wheel battle with Sainz and also with Norris early on the first lap. He ended up in 5th place ahead of both Bottas and Sainz, who'd both shown that they had better race pace than the Australian. Okay, so those were the highs. Now let's get into who had a weekend to forget. I have to give the first low to Mercedes. Aside from Hamilton's storming drive and coming close to winning the race, it really was a disappointing weekend for Mercedes on a circuit that they are usually so strong at. They were forced to change the floors on both cars due to the bumpy surface, which cost them performance and something that Toto Wolff described as possibly being a bloodbath if they didn't make the change. And Bottas was forced to take another grid penalty due to unreliability, which left him unable to play a part in Hamilton's battle with the two Red Bulls. The Finn did admit that it was going to be hard to pass on Sunday, but he'll feel like 5th place was possible in the race. He didn't make the best start and he got caught up early on with the AlphaTauris and actually dropped down to 10th in the opening laps. When he did finally get past Tsunoda and Gasly retired, he managed to close the gap to the battle with Sainz and Norris quite quickly, but if they have any more weekends like this, Red Bull will be creeping up on them in the Constructors' Championship as well. What Mercedes need now is no more reliability issues, and they need both cars in the fight for those remaining races, especially as we expect Red Bull to be strong on the upcoming circuits. The second low this weekend goes to Alpine, who had an utterly miserable race. Both cars were forced to retire, but they didn't really look like having the pace for points anyway. Alonso had done well to make up ground from the back of the grid, but his scraps with the Alfa Romeo drivers were messy and cost him time. He also had a bit of a nostalgic scrap with Kimi Raikkonen, where he felt like the Finn had passed him off of the track, which then led to a really funny exchange between Alan Permain and Michael Massey over the radio. Esteban Ocon's race was pretty much over at turn 1 due to damage, and he retired the car. Alonso then had a problem with the rear wing, which forced him out of the race. This was a weekend to forget for the French squad, and a turnaround is needed, especially as AlphaTauri have been inching closer to them in the Constructors' Championship in recent races. Alfa Romeo looked like possible point scorers this weekend, but I'm actually going to give them the third low in the end. Kimi Raikkonen was on for 10th place, but a late spin dropped him behind Sebastian Vettel. Undid a lot of their good work from earlier on as they worked their way through the pack. In a season where points have been really hard to come by for the Italian squad, this was a really disappointing result and a real opportunity to actually score some points. And it's a final low for Lando Norris and McLaren from this weekend. Whilst 5th and 8th doesn't look like a bad haul, they are now just 3.5 points ahead of Ferrari in the Constructors' Championship, and it looks like only a matter of time before those places switch hands. For Norris, this was a really rare anonymous race. He's been so impressive and consistent in general, but he never looked like getting anywhere near Ricciardo this weekend. You could question whether he was aggressive or punchy enough with Sainz and Ricciardo at the beginning, and then it seemed like he really settled into 8th place after that. McLaren will need Norris back on top form if they have any chance of keeping the prancing horse at bay in the final few rounds. There you have it, those are our highs and lows from the US Grand Prix. I'd love to get your thoughts on the Hamilton-Verstappen Championship battle, what you thought of the race, and anything else that we've talked about in this video. And for more content like this, please subscribe to Formula Pulse. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back with more after the Mexican Grand Prix.